Hi guys, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the sport-specific needs analysis. And essentially what we're going to do is find a way to step into working with a population or group that we have almost no experience with and doing an excellent job of it just by performing this needs analysis and determining what we can do to help them out, what they need, whether that be for performance, for injury prevention, for you name it. That's going to be our needs analysis. Before we get into it, we're going to take a step back a little bit and look at the evidence-based practice. So evidence-based practice and exercise science. And that term evidence-based practice started getting a little bit more popular back in the 1980s in the medical field. And what these physicians were sort of determining is that there had been life-determining decisions being made on sort of some outdated information. And so as a field, they sort of took a step back and they made it a bigger priority to update textbooks and make sure that business practices were not just being handed down from one generation of physicians to the next, but that they were looking at research and at evidence to help make decisions to improve the quality of care and improve their life-saving abilities. And as exercise scientists, we can take that same approach, is to be current on our research, current on the latest information, and that's going to help us make our decisions, which can also sometimes be life determining, and we can hopefully prevent some injuries, and we can also just help people achieve their goals. And in order to do this, in order to carry over this EBP to exercise science, what we're going to need to do is stay current with our research. Either subscribe to a series of journals that will just be delivered to you and bring some of the latest research to you. Make a habit of going online and getting access to peer-reviewed research articles, and or join an organization such as the National Strength and Conditioning Association, which will hold a priority to push research and push education. So the NSCA is an excellent organization for that. Beware of blindly following recommendations from experts, or I don't know, we should call them like internet gurus. Whether they've got a PhD or they're just shredded and they look great online, whatever it is, but just kind of take everything with a grain of salt and always be looking for that evidence-based best practice. And it's a continuous process. What you learn today may very well be different down the road. I know that was the case for me as a personal trainer back in 2006, and now it's 2020. A lot of the things that I was telling clients and practicing back then, I no longer tell clients and I no longer practice now, because not only has some of the research come out and changed, but also my own experience in trying to apply things and maybe failing or succeeding, I've changed over time as well. So I apply what I know to be evidence-based best practice. And that's a combination of what I've seen in peer-reviewed articles, what I've learned through organizations, and what I've learned from experts, and also just mistakes that I've made on my own. And this process takes place in the medical field and elsewhere by developing the question, finding evidence for or against that question, evaluating the evidence, integrate the evidence into practice, and reevaluate the evidence. So for example, what if we're looking at a group of previously untrained healthy females, and we're curious, is performing 3 sets per exercise superior to performing 1 set per exercise over the course of an 8 to 12 week resistance training program for improving back squat? Well, we've got a question We could look for evidence in the form of research articles and peer-reviewed research. We can evaluate that evidence. Some articles we may agree with, they may make better sense to us, and we take that information and we can integrate it into practice. Maybe putting athletes through a squat program over 8 to 12 weeks, right? And then at the end of those 8 to 12 weeks, we're going to reevaluate the evidence. How did my group of healthy females who train with 3 sets per exercise do compared to my group of healthy females who train with 1 set per exercise? And then that's going to help us develop our own EBP. So yes, we do want to stress the importance of high quality research and resources. Peer-reviewed articles are best, but they're not the only thing. Professional experience, again, things that I have read that I was told should be working, that worked in a research setting, I attempted to implement in the real world, and either I failed or I did something wrong, or I just got different results. And so maybe I kept some of those things, or maybe I discarded them and I moved on. So my experience is another factor. It's not just what I'm reading out of a book. And I don't think you guys should do that either. Be sure to interact with colleagues. If you can share notes on what you're doing, what they're doing, who's doing what that's working, who's doing what that's not working, and attend conferences and seminars to hear some leaders in the field speak. These are things that you can do that will speed up your learning and your efficiency and proficiency as an exercise scientist at a much greater rate. And then as far as bro science or anecdotes go, sometimes you just have to beware and kind of filter through them, because a lot of times what's happening in a weight room with just practitioners, lifters, bodybuilders, what they're doing in a weight room may not be proven through science yet, but it will be one day. And then you also need to watch out for misinformation. We're in an age where people are very quick to jump on YouTube and try to make a buck. So if someone is kind of throwing together a YouTube series and maybe they're a very attractive person with a lot of muscles and not very much fat, and they're tan and whatever it is, if they are, and they're wealthy, all that good stuff, we can all think of a couple of individuals like that who they drive around in their Lamborghinis on their way to the gym or whatever it is. Can we trust them? Are they really pushing the best evidence, the best practices? Or maybe are they just trying to make some money off of us? So that's something to be aware of as well. That's another sort of push for evidence-based best practice and peer-reviewed articles. Again, evaluating the evidence. Carefully consider the strengths and weaknesses of each form of evidence. Again, do our researchers, are they being paid by a protein company to evaluate the protein? There might be some bias there. Sometimes you need that unbiased third party to perform the research. Are we watching a YouTube video of somebody on steroids who's trying to sell us a meal plan or a workout plan? Maybe that's something to be aware of and is to be cautious of as well. And then finally, what we're going to start to do is take what we're learning and actually start to apply it. And from there, we get our own personal experience. And I can speak from experience that sometimes you read something and then you try it out and it works. It really sticks with you. And sometimes when you read something and you try it out and it fails or bombs, that sticks with you too. And you just learn, as time goes on, you sort of learn what to keep and what to discard. If we're talking about athletes and clients, sometimes you can't always do what's best. Sometimes you can only do what's appropriate. So if I write this program out that I think is outstanding and it's going to help them become national champions and go undefeated all season, well, if their head coach starts canceling lifts, then my program changes. I have to figure out how to alter it, and I can't just do double the workload in the next the workout session, or I can't just give them some insane crazy workout every time they come in just because the coach sort of cut my time a little bit. Or what if there is sort of some rampant injuries? If you have low back injuries that sort of start and your team starts falling like dominoes, you know that you need to change something, or you need to change something whether it's your fault or not. As far as budget goes, you may show up and have some program that you want to train your team with, and it turns out that you don't have the equipment that you intended, or it turns out that you're not going to have the food and the supplements that you intended. Well, that's going to change what you're doing. So you have to constantly be adapting. And as you go through the program, taking some sort of measurements, some sort of metrics, and these measurements and metrics can be how much an individual squats or some strength performances. It could be other physical performances like speed or endurance, but you can also do surveys. You can ask athletes how they're feeling. You can survey the coaches and ask how the athletes are performing. So reevaluating the evidence, I like the saying is that you measure what you treasure. And so if you are trying to integrate all of these best practices into training and into helping teams and athletes progress, if you don't have any measurements, it can be really hard to prove what's going on. And that's sort of what we're hint, that's sort of what we're going towards. And if you're working in the personal training industry, if weight loss is your big goal, then you probably want that individual to step on a scale every once in a while, maybe do some measurements to see what's going on with their body. So strength training is fine, but if an individual wants to get leaner, increasing their bench press, they may not care about that, right? And I'll say this on a very regular basis, is that the goal is to keep the goal the goal. So if a coach comes in and tells me they want to win, or and they feel like they can do that by getting their athletes better cardiovascular endurance, well, maybe I test them and I find that their cardiovascular endurance is incredibly good, but that they all are very weak in the squat. If I'm raising the squat up and their cardiovascular endurance drops off, I'm not working towards the goal. So I need to be working towards the goal. And sometimes you're told what that goal is, and sometimes you can infer how to achieve that goal on your own. And so a story that I'll mention multiple times throughout this program is going and working at the University of Missouri with the football team in the summer of 2012. So the Mizzou Tigers. And with that program, in the weight room, they really emphasize strength training, powerlifting, the bench press, the squat, and an Olympic variation is the hang clean. And they like those numbers to be big, and they measured jumps, broad jumps, vertical jumps. They measured sprints, and they placed a high value on this. So if an athlete wanted to come in and lift weights and take their time and sort of sip water in between sets and maybe talk a little bit, or grab a protein shake and kind of come back around a little bit later to hit some sets, that was fine, because the goal was to keep them feeling well so that they could really perform in the weight room. Now, during that same summer, I went down to Waco, Texas, and worked with the Baylor football team. And the Baylor Bears, they train differently. They're playing the same sport. They're still playing football. But at Baylor, you came in, the whole team ran, there was a very short break, and then they went to the weight room and lifted. And during that lift, if you weren't sweating and moving, you were doing something wrong. you had to stay on the move. Now, both groups were both playing the same sport and more or less at the same level, kind of in different conferences, but essentially at the same level. What was different? Well, their head coaches told the strength staff what they wanted. At Mizzou, Gary Pinkel told the strength staff that he wanted to have the biggest, strongest players on the field. And he even gave them years of numbers of strength numbers of teams that he's had before. But down at Baylor, Art Briles told the strength staff, I want to push the pace harder than any other team that we're going to play this year. And so that's what they did. So sometimes, even as a exercise scientist, you have an opinion or you know the best thing to do, but sometimes you sort of have marching orders, and that becomes your goal. And the goal is to keep the goal the goal. So some practical use for it. If there is new equipment or a piece of machinery that you've used before with great success that helps prevent injuries or rehab injuries, that might be something that you're going to try to get into your new facility. Or if you've never seen it before and you're just reading about it and hearing great things and the research coming out on it is excellent, then you're probably going to want to get it. And on the backside of that, I would say that sometimes you're going to have things that are supposed to be great, but really aren't. And no offense to anybody, but when I think about something that I saw and I used when I first started out, I think about a BOSU ball. So BOSU is BOSU, both sides up is kind of the acronym from what I'm told. And that's the ball that is flat on one side and round on the other. And it makes for sort of a great balancing test, and you can use it for some great exercises. But we were using it, we were abusing that thing, and we were taking a lot of risks with it. They were kind of unnecessary. We were putting ourselves in poor biomechanical movement patterns, and we were really kind of trying to play with it and make it work. But in reality, it's an okay tool. It's got some great uses. It's not a bad tool. There's no such thing as a bad tool, but it wasn't appropriate for what we were doing. And so back when I started 14, 15 years ago, it was something that I really believed in. Whereas now, if I had one around, I might use it every once in a while, but it's just not too big of a priority for me. Okay, so now we're going to try to talk a little bit more sport specific and kind of cut to the meat of the action here. So really what we're talking about today, after all of that kind of background and conjecture, is what we're talking about is what are you going to do if and when you're placed in charge of a team that maybe you don't know anything about? How are you going to go from 0 to 60 in training them and creating a program that's going to help out those individuals? Whether that's a sport you've never worked with, like myself in 2012, I became a cheerleading strength coach. I didn't really know what I was getting into, but I knew I wanted to be a strength coach, and I knew I had a group that wanted some strength coaching, so I had an opportunity and I jumped on it. So there I am, 2012. I've got a cheerleading team that needs strength conditioning. What the heck do you do? Well, performing a needs analysis is a great way to get started, whether it's cheerleading team or a badminton team or a group of taekwondo fighters or something that you're not familiar with. That's what our needs analysis, that's where it comes into play. Or if it's just a new individual, if you're a personal trainer and you've got a client coming in and you've never worked with them before, your needs analysis is going to be a great way to get started. So again, the goal is to keep the goal the goal. And as I personal trained for several years, quite a few years. I'll tell you that I've done it before. Is I've assumed that an individual was coming in for with a fat loss goal, a weight loss goal, and they tell me that they want to get stronger. Okay, well, that's a good way to kind of put your foot in your mouth if you are assuming what their goal is. So with the needs analysis, one of the best things you can do is start by asking what a goal is. And then as an exercise scientist, as a professional, you filter that to help them be successful. So we can't give them goals, but we know that if an athlete comes to us and they're very, very fast, but they have very poor conditioning, and they are and they're on the soccer team, well, we know that soccer kind of challenges their aerobic system and that they need some conditioning. You can't just be fast and be okay on a soccer team. You need some conditioning as well. So they may tell us that they want us to get faster, and we can work on that, but is that going to be our top and only priority, or should we maybe work on some of that conditioning as well? We don't want to do anything behind their back, but we want to clue them in and be able to make decisions and convince them about why maybe we need to go in slightly a different direction with the training. So whether you have a cheerleader or a taekwondo athlete or whatever it is, when you have something new and you're not familiar with it, that's how we get into our needs analysis. Step one, start by classifying the sport into categories. Is it a sprint sport, an intermittent sprint sport, transition game, or just endurance? And where it's going to fall there is going to help us determine what sort of training we need to do. And why is that important? Well, depending on how the sport is played, the body is going to utilize different energy systems. And if you're not familiar with these energy systems, we'll just get into them real quickly. Our body uses about 3 different energy systems. For short 5 to 10 second efforts, we're going to use our phosphagen system. For middle range efforts, 15 seconds to 2 minutes, we're going to use glycolysis. And for longer efforts of 3 minutes and more, we'll be using our oxidative system. So if the sport is going to exist and predominantly be a sub 5 second effort, such as a shot put on a track and field team, we probably don't need to have excellent oxidative energy level systems, because that's not going to have a whole lot to do with what we're competing in. And vice versa, if we have a marathon runner, they're going to basically exist in that oxidative system. They probably don't need to be an incredibly good 40-yard sprinter. That's probably not going to have a whole lot to do with what their sport is. And it's common that an athlete will use each of these systems sort of interchangeably. So let's go back to our soccer athlete. When they do a short sprint, they're using their phosphagen system. And as they break into another sprint, eventually that phosphagen system will run out, and then they'll fall into the glycolysis. And maybe they're involved in about 3 minutes of pretty rapid play. And after about 3 minutes of pretty rapid play, they're going to fall into that oxidative system. And then maybe the ball gets kicked out of bounds, or they go onto the sideline and back in. They get a little bit of a break, and then the cycle can start over again, because we will replenish our energy systems. So now that we know where the bulk of the energy is spent, do we only train in that energy window? Does a sprinter ever need to train like a marathoner? Does a marathoner ever need to train like a sprinter? Do football players need to do distance running? And I think you can make great arguments that they all need to have a variety of training. And our sprinter, why would they need to train with longer distance training? Well, that's going to improve the quality, their heart rate. It's going to boost their health. And it can also just help them recover. So that sprinting is such a high intense activity that maybe a longer bout of running at a lower intensity could almost be like a recovery for them. And how about a marathoner running sprints? That's not such a bad idea either, because if you've ever been at the end of a race, you'll see that it's very common that sprints occur for the last quarter mile or so. Is that they want to finish strong, and if they're neck and neck with somebody else, those 26.2 miles could really come down to the last 200 yards. How about a football player ever needing to do distance running? I've worked with football for a long time, and a ridiculously long play in football lasts about 7 seconds. It's not a long sport, and they usually get rest in between. But would distance running possibly help them have better cardiovascular endurance? Would it help them be prepared in the event that there's a hurry up offense and they need to be able to perform and play with very, very minimal rest in between? Or what about when they've played a hard series and they come over the sideline and then there's a turnover and they're back on the sideline again? Or maybe a high school player who's sort of a stud on the team and is they're on offense, defense, special teams, and they just never come off. Those athletes may really benefit, even though they play football, they may really benefit from distance running. All right, so let's look at our biomechanical characteristics. What is that athlete doing during their sport? Maybe this is a foreign sport, maybe badminton, but let's just look, and you kind of break it down throughout each of those categories. And this is going to help us set that compass, look for that next step, and help determine what we actually need to be doing while we're training. Some more considerations might be contact. Men's lacrosse is a contact sport with helmets. Women's lacrosse is not a contact sport. They wear goggles instead. Now, I would argue that if you've watched a little bit of women's lacrosse, as I have, it often becomes pretty physical. But in the rule book, it's not really supposed to. But anyways, that's sort of a different tangent. But what is the sport supposed to be doing, and what is it actually doing? Contact, in cheerleading, everybody's on the same team. The other team doesn't run run out in the middle of your routine and like put a shoulder into you. But injuries and contact is actually pretty common. Our cheerleaders get hurt pretty regularly. So when I was a cheerleading coach, I looked at the frequency of concussions, and we actually increased their neck training in an effort to reduce concussion frequency and concussion severity. So sometimes you're not supposed to have contact, such as cheerleading or women's lacrosse, but sometimes you have it anyways. So more factors that we might take into consideration. Let's look at the length of season. Some sports have only one peak per year. Some have multiple peaks throughout the year. And sometimes it's not even the sport you're playing, but the level you're playing it at. A high school football player in the South might play year round, and in the North, not as much because of weather. Same thing for a lot of other sports, and just the ability to stay outside when it's freezing cold or not. At the collegiate level, golf has a spring and a fall season where they have a peak in the fall and a peak in the spring. If you have a individual athlete, maybe they're doing 5Ks and progressing to 10Ks or half marathons, and maybe they get to pick their own schedule, and you can design that schedule to fit with your training, or if they're just doing it as they like, then your training needs to fit that schedule. Same thing goes with maybe a recreational golfer. So all the players on a team are not training the same. Not only will people have their own unique injuries and needs and maybe some body composition efforts that you need to make, but looking at the actual position. So how about in football? In football, some of the guys on the team don't even look like they play the same sport. They don't even look like they're the same species. If you take a over 300-pound lineman and stand him next to a under 150-pound defensive back, you can just tell right away that they probably don't need to be training the exact same way. In soccer, our field players need excellent cardiovascular conditioning as well as speed, but our goalie needs to be a little bit more reactive and have excellent jumping. Baseball, pitcher versus catcher versus outfielder, and track, the 100-meter sprinter versus the 100-meter hurdler, or the 100-meter sprinter versus the 10,000-meter speed walker. Understand your qualities of the athlete. Age, you have chronological age. So what does their birth date say? You have biological age. Personally, when I was in middle school, I was short, and I was around guys that were taller than me, and they had full beards. And, you know, it was like that for a little bit of high school as well. And some people have different levels of hormones in their body at different ages. So biological age might vary depending, especially if you're working with a youth population. And then also on the back end is that some 40-year-olds can train as hard as any 25-year-old, and other 40-year-olds who maybe haven't taken care of themselves or have unlucky genetics or have some injuries, you might be training some of those almost like the geriatric population. Hopefully not. And then your training age. How many years of quality training do you have under your belt? As a college strength coach, I would often see 18 and 20-year-olds who walk in the door that they look like professional athletes who might even be on some type of steroid. But in reality, they're just good-looking men and women who they appear like they've been training very hard and very diligently, but it might just be genetic. They're just tall and muscular and lean. And so they sort of give that impressive appearance as an older individual, but in reality, they're just kind of babies and they don't know their way around the weight room yet. And on the other end, you might have a 15-year-old who's been training with high-quality coaches for the last 5 years. So you need to do some investigation and ask, and don't really take their word for it. And just a reminder, if you're asking how much they train and how much they lift, males will always lie to you about how much they bench press. So make them prove it, and whatever they tell you, usually shave off about 30 pounds. Level of development. Some athletes are just great in the weight room. I got to work in the NFL for the 2010 season with the St. Louis Rams. And there was some men in there who hadn't really done Olympic level lifts throughout their high school or collegiate careers. And you just told them or showed them what to do once, and they did it better than you did. So some highly skilled people are just able to do things really, really well. And on the other hand, some athletes, you just push them and try to train them, and it just takes a while. Even a great coach may really struggle to get some athletes to be moving and performing well. So you just got to know your athletes. Understanding common injuries. If there's one thing that we can do as strength coaches or exercise scientists, is to prevent injuries. We can't prevent them all. You can do all the ACL prevention work you want, but if a young man is on the football field and two 300-pound linemen fall on the side of his leg, and so he's got 600 pounds of sheer force coming on his knee, there might be nothing that we can do to prevent some type of injury there. Know what kind of repetitive or overuse injuries you have. Our cross-country athletes will get foot, ankle, and knee injuries, possibly hip. Our football players are at risk for concussions. Baseball players are going to be at risk for shoulder and elbow issues. And our female athletes are going to be at a higher risk for ACL tears. And that has to do with, I'm not being a misogynist here, that just has to do with the fact that nature has designed them just a little bit different so that they are able to bear children. And so that creates a relationship between their hips and their knees called the Q angle. And so at their knee, whereas a male is fortunate to have narrower hips, so our knees sit right underneath us, the female hip usually gears the femurs out wider, and so there becomes what is called a Q angle from that knee to the femur, and so that puts them at a slightly greater risk for ACL tears. And finally, I think I've kind of repeated myself enough that you guys are going to get this, but I would encourage you not to judge a book by its cover. So beware of making a snap decision concerning programming, whether you're reading a big fancy research article or a research study, you're attending a conference and somebody with 3 PhDs is up there talking. Take everything with a grain of salt. So if they are saying it and it sounds good, tentatively integrate it into what you're doing and judge for yourself. So a few people I would say beware of is the fit individual. Watch out for that person at the gym who has muscles on muscles and no body fat, and they move a great amount of weight. Maybe they're just doing what works for them. Maybe they're using some special aids that you're not using, or maybe they're just lucky. So not to take away from them and the hard work they're doing, but maybe those things are not going to work for you anywhere near as well as they're working for that individual. I'd also say beware of the PhD. Nothing wrong with education, obviously, but just because someone has a PhD does not mean that they know it all. We want to listen to them and integrate what they teach and what they're saying, and integrate it and judge for ourselves. Beware the college instructor. Just because someone is teaching it to you does not mean that it's true or that it's going to always be true. I was taught things differently 15 years ago than I'm taught today. I was telling people things differently 15 years ago than I'm telling them today. So that's the pro and con of this whole science thing, is that when we say theory, a theory is different from a fact. And a lot of what we're doing is working on theory. We have a whole lot of science, but as exercise scientists, what we're really doing is combining that science with art. And our programming and our training is going to exist somewhere in between there. And sometimes it's going to be over here, sometimes it'll be over there. Beware the internet guru. Watch out for those Instagram models and whoever else it is, especially if they're just trying to sell you something, which is commonly what they're doing. Again, maybe listen to them. Maybe they've got the latest secret on what's going on and what's going to be the cutting edge on the next wave of training. And that's often the case, is that people who are practitioners are in the weight room day after day. They're discovering things that science and research has not yet discovered. And then beware the latest fad or gizmo. Just because it's shiny and expensive does not mean that it's going to work.